The morning Nettie Groves was put out of the only home she'd ever known. The temperature in Harlan County, Kentucky, had already dropped below freezing. It was October of 1934, and the woman who'd raised her, a sharp-boned aunt named Cora Sloan, stood in the doorway of her clapboard house and told the girl not to come back. Nettie was 16 years old. She had a canvas satchel with 2 dresses, a pair of wool socks with holes at the toes, a Bible her mother had owned, and exactly $10 folded into a square and tucked inside her left shoe. That was everything. That was all of it. Cora's reason was simple and final. Her new husband, Dale, didn't want another mouth to feed. Times were hard. The mines were laying off. Cora said it plain. You're old enough to find work or find a man. Either way, you ain't staying here. But there was more to it than that, and everyone in the hollow knew it. Dale Sloan had taken a liking to looking at Nettie in ways that made her skin crawl, and when Nettie had told Aunt Cora about it, quietly, carefully, the way you'd set down something made of glass, Cora had slapped her across the mouth and called her a liar. The next morning, Nettie's things were in a pile on the porch. That's how it happened. No hearing, no second chance. A girl who'd already lost both parents to typhoid fever by the age of 9 was now standing on a dirt road in the foothills of the Appalachians with no family, no prospects, and winter bearing down like a freight train. The people of Sutter's Hollow watched her walk down the main road that morning. Some watched from porches. A few watched from behind curtains. Mrs. Eubanks at the general store came outside and pressed a tin of sardines into Nettie's hand without saying a word. And that small kindness almost broke the girl more than anything else, because it meant even the kind ones weren't going to fight for her. They'd feed her on the way out, but they wouldn't make her stay. Nettie Groves walked south out of Sutter's Hollow with her chin up and her eyes dry, and nobody expected to see her again. If you want to find out how a 16-year-old girl with $10 and a canvas bag survived a Kentucky winter alone and eventually built something that changed an entire region, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Nettie Groves created in those mountains wasn't just survival. It was a kind of miracle grown from rock and stubbornness and soil. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Nettie was before that morning. She'd come to live with Aunt Cora at 9, after the fever took both her parents within a week of each other. Her father, Samuel Groves, had been a miner who read books, an unusual combination in that part of Kentucky in those years. He'd kept a shelf of volumes above the kitchen stove, an encyclopedia set missing the letter M, a water-stained copy of Erta Knowles' Farming Almanac, 2 novels by Dickens, and a government pamphlet about soil conservation that he'd sent away from the county extension office. Nettie had grown up turning those pages the way other children turned over rocks in the creek, with curiosity and hunger and a sense that something alive might be underneath. Her mother, Pearl, had kept a garden that was legendary in the hollow. Even in the poorest years, Pearl Groves had coaxed tomatoes and pole beans and squash from the thin mountain soil. She'd composted. She'd mulched with oak leaves. She'd saved seeds in labeled envelopes and stored them in a coffee tin. When Pearl died, people in the hollow mourned her garden almost as much as they mourned the woman herself. And that tells you something about how thin the line between life and death was in those mountains during those years. Nettie had inherited both gifts, her father's love of reading and her mother's understanding of soil. At Aunt Cora's house, she'd been put to work immediately, washing, scrubbing, hauling water, minding Cora's 2 younger children, splitting kindling. The work was endless and thankless, and Cora treated her not as a niece but as unpaid help who ought to be grateful for the charity of a roof. But Nettie read. She read by candlelight after everyone was asleep. She read during the 15-minute walk to the schoolhouse and the 15-minute walk back. She read while stirring soup. The schoolteacher, a tired young man named Mr. Calloway, who'd come down from Lexington as part of a rural education program, noticed her and started lending her books from his own collection. Agricultural science, basic botany, a worn copy of Liberty Hyde Bailey's writings on horticulture. Nettie absorbed it all with a thirst that startled him. "That girl's got a mind like a steel trap, mister," Calloway once told the postmaster. "She's wasted here." The postmaster had shrugged. "She's a girl. What's she going to do with botany?" That was the world Nettie lived in, a world that saw her hunger for knowledge as a defect, her curiosity as insolence, and her dreams as a kind of stubbornness that needed to be broken like a horse. Now she was walking south, and none of that knowledge seemed worth much against the cold. The first 2 days were the hardest she'd ever lived through. She walked nearly 20 miles, sleeping the first night in a hay barn she found unlocked, and the second night under a rock overhang that kept off the worst of the rain, but none of the cold. She ate the sardines Mrs. Eubanks had given her and drank from a creek that ran clear and icy beside the road. By the second morning, she was shaking so badly she could barely open her satchel. On the afternoon of the third day, following a logging road that wound up into the mountains above Caney Creek, Nettie found the cave. It wasn't much to look at from the outside. A limestone opening about 7 feet high and 5 feet across, partially screened by laurel bushes and a stand of hemlocks. A person could walk right past it and never notice. But Nettie noticed because she was looking for anything that might keep her alive another night. She pushed through the laurel and stepped inside, and what she found changed the entire course of her life. The cave went back nearly 40 feet into the hillside, narrowing gradually, but never becoming impassable. The floor was dry, remarkably dry, with a layer of sandy gravel that had been packed smooth by what looked like years of water flow that had since redirected. The ceiling was high enough to stand in for the first 20 feet, then sloped to about 4.5 feet near the back. And the temperature, this was the thing that made Nettie stand very still and close her eyes. The temperature inside the cave was warm. Not heated room warm, but a steady, constant warmth that felt like early autumn compared to the biting cold outside. Nettie would later learn that this was a common property of deep limestone caves in the region. The earth itself maintained a temperature somewhere between 50 and 55 degrees year-round, regardless of the weather above. Miners knew this. Farmers sometimes stored root vegetables in cave openings for this very reason. But for Nettie, in that moment, it felt like the mountain had opened its mouth and breathed warmth onto her frozen hands, and she sat down on the sandy floor and cried for the first time since Aunt Cora had told her to leave. She stayed. That first week, she did nothing but survive. She gathered fallen wood and built a small fire near the entrance, learning quickly that the cave drew air inward and vented smoke through invisible cracks in the limestone above, a natural chimney that kept the interior clear. She found a creek 100 yards downhill and carried water in the sardine tin. She collected late-season hickory nuts and the last of the autumn persimmons, which had been touched by frost and turned sweet. She explored the cave methodically, finding that it branched into 2 smaller passages near the back, one of which had a shallow pool of clean water fed by seepage through the rock. On the 4th day, she walked 3 miles to a crossroads where a man was selling used goods from the back of a truck. With her $10, her entire fortune, she bought a wool army blanket for $2, a dented pot for 50 cents, a box of matches for a dime, a small hand trowel for 35 cents, and a sack of dried beans for 40 cents. She had $6.65 left. She carried everything back to the cave in her arms, making 2 trips, and she arranged her possessions along the cave wall with the care of a woman setting up a house. That was her booth. That was what $10 could buy in the mountains of Kentucky in 1934. A blanket, a pot, some beans, a trowel, and the darkness of a cave for walls. It wasn't a home by any definition that most people would recognize. But Nettie Groves, sitting cross-legged on her army blanket that night, eating beans she'd boiled in a dented pot over a small fire, Nettie felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like she belonged somewhere. Then the winter came. The first real cold arrived in November, and it came with a violence that the old-timers in Harlan County would talk about for decades. Temperatures dropped below zero. Snow piled up 2 and 3 feet deep in the hollows. Creek water froze solid. Animals that hadn't denned early enough simply died where they stood. Inside the cave, the temperature held at 52 degrees. Nettie survived that first winter through a combination of desperation, intelligence, and a 14-year-old's sheer inability to accept defeat. She'd spent the weeks before the deep cold preparing. She'd gathered armloads of dried leaves and grass and packed them along the cave walls for insulation. She'd built a crude door at the entrance from laurel branches woven together and stuffed with moss. She'd stockpiled firewood deeper in the cave where it stayed dry. She'd found a patch of wild onions near the creek and dug up as many bulbs as she could before the ground froze, storing them in the back of the cave where the temperature stayed constant. The worst moment came in January. A week-long cold snap dropped temperatures to 15 below zero, and Nettie ran out of dry firewood. She was burning green wood that smoked terribly and gave off almost no heat. She developed a cough that turned into something deeper, something that sat in her chest like a stone. For 3 days, she lay on her blanket, shivering, too weak to walk to the creek for water. She drank from the seepage pool at the back of the cave, dragging herself along the floor on her hands and knees. On the 4th day, when she was beginning to consider the very real possibility that she was going to die in this cave and nobody would ever know, she heard a sound at the entrance, a scraping, a shuffling, and then a voice, old, rough, annoyed, saying, "Well, you're either the stubbornest girl in Kentucky or the dumbest. I reckon we'll find out which." The voice belonged to Hazel Combs. Hazel was 71 years old, a widow who lived alone in a cabin about 1.5 miles up the mountain from Nettie's cave. She'd been a midwife and herb woman for 40 years, and she knew those mountains the way a person knows the rooms of their own house. She'd noticed smoke coming from the cave mouth weeks ago and had been watching from a distance, curious but cautious. When the smoke stopped for 3 days, she came to check. She found Nettie half-conscious, burning with fever, and thin as a creek reed. Hazel Combs did not carry Nettie to her cabin. She was too old, and Nettie was too weak to be moved far. Instead, she brought help to the cave. She built up the fire with seasoned hardwood she hauled from her own woodpile. She brewed a tea from boneset and elderberry bark and held Nettie's head up while she drank it. She brought a jar of chicken broth, still warm, and spooned it between the girl's cracked lips. It took 8 days, but Nettie pulled through. When she could sit up again, Hazel sat across the fire from her and said, "You want to tell me what a child is doing living in a hole in the ground?" Nettie told her everything. Hazel listened without interruption, her face unreadable in the firelight. When Nettie finished, the old woman was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Your mama was Pearl Groves?" "Yes, ma'am." "I delivered you," Hazel said. Summer of 1918, hot as blazes. Your mama labored 14 hours and never once screamed. Toughest woman I ever attended. She looked at Nettie for a long moment. I see her in you. That was the beginning of everything. Hazel didn't invite Nettie to come live with her, and Nettie didn't ask. Both of them understood something about the other without discussing it. They were people who needed their own space, their own territory, their own solitude. But Hazel began coming to the cave every few days, and what she brought was more valuable than food or blankets. She brought knowledge. Hazel knew which plants were edible and which were poison. She knew where ginseng grew and how to harvest it without killing the patch. She knew how to read weather and the behavior of animals and the color of the sky. And she knew something else, something that would become the foundation of everything Nettie built. She knew about the old root cellars. Scattered throughout those mountains were dozens of abandoned homesteads from an earlier generation of settlers, families who had tried to farm the steep hillsides and eventually given up or been driven out by the difficulty of it. Many of them had dug root cellars into the hillsides, using the same principle that made Nettie's cave warm, the earth's constant temperature. Some of these cellars were substantial, stone-lined chambers 10 or 12 feet deep, built with the careful masonry of people who intended to stay forever. Your cave is just a big root cellar that God dug, Hazel told her one afternoon. But root cellars can do more than store food. A man over in Wise County, Virginia, years back, he grew lettuce and mushrooms in his cellar all winter long. Temperature stays the same. You just need light for the lettuce. That sentence, "you just need light," planted a seed in Nettie's mind that would grow for the next 60 years. When spring came, Nettie emerged from her cave winter thinner, harder, and burning with an idea. She spent that first spring and summer doing two things: growing food to survive and experimenting. Using the trowel she'd bought and tools Hazel lent her, she cleared a small patch of ground near the cave entrance where sunlight reached for about 6 hours a day. She planted beans, squash, and corn, the traditional three sisters her mother had grown. She composted leaves and creek muck and her own waste, building soil the way her mother had taught her. The garden was tiny, barely 10 feet square, but it produced. At the same time, she began modifying the cave. She'd remembered something from one of Mr. Calloway's books, a description of how Korean and Chinese farmers had for centuries grown vegetables in partially underground structures that trapped heat from the sun during the day and released it slowly at night. The book had called them underground greenhouses, or walapinis. The principle was simple: dig into a south-facing hillside, create a sloped roof of transparent material to let in sunlight, and let the earth's warmth do the rest. Nettie couldn't afford glass, but she could reshape the entrance to her cave. Over the course of that first summer, working with a hand trowel, a borrowed pickaxe, and her bare hands, Nettie widened the cave entrance to about 12 feet across. She dug out the floor on the south side, creating a sloped growing bed that angled upward toward the light. She built a frame from hickory poles and stretched over it the only transparent material she could find: oiled flour sacks that Hazel helped her prepare by rubbing them with rendered lard until they became translucent. It wasn't glass. It let in maybe a third of the light that glass would have, but it let in light. That first underground garden was laughably small, about 60 square feet of growing space, tucked into the mouth of a limestone cave in the Kentucky mountains. But in December of 1935, when the temperature outside dropped to 10 degrees, Nettie Groves harvested a head of lettuce from that growing bed. It was small and pale and slightly bitter, and she ate it with tears running down her face because it tasted like proof that she wasn't crazy. Proof that what she'd imagined was real. Proof that something could grow even in the darkest, coldest season if you understood the science behind it. By the second year, word had begun to spread. A hunter passing through noticed the garden outside the cave and stopped to talk. A woman from a settlement 8 miles away heard about the cave girl and came to see for herself. Hazel, who despite her solitude was plugged into the mountain gossip network in the way that all longtime residents are, began telling people about what Nettie was doing. The reactions were mixed. Some people thought she was touched in the head. A girl living in a cave, growing lettuce underground. It sounded like a fairy tale or a symptom of madness. But others, especially women who understood what it meant to watch children go hungry in February, were curious. In the spring of 1936, 3 women from Caney Creek walked up the mountain to see Nettie's operation. She showed them everything: the cave, the growing beds, the oiled sack panels, the composting system. She explained the science as best she understood it, talking about soil temperature and light angles and the way the limestone walls stored heat during the day. The women listened quietly. One of them, a mother of 6 named Bertie Shepherd, stood in the cave mouth looking at the small green shoots pushing up from the growing bed in March, while snow still lay on the ground outside, and said, "Lord have mercy. Can you teach me this?" Nettie could, and she did. Over the next 5 years, Nettie Groves taught over 40 families in Harlan and Letcher counties how to build what she called earth shelters. Simple underground growing structures built into south-facing hillsides using local materials. The designs evolved as she learned. The oiled flour sacks were replaced with actual glass when a window factory in Corbin started selling cracked and imperfect panes at a penny apiece. The growing beds got deeper and more sophisticated. Nettie developed a system of reflective surfaces, sheets of tin from flattened cans, that bounced additional light onto the growing beds. She figured out that certain crops thrived in the low light conditions: lettuce, spinach, kale, radishes, turnips, and herbs. She experimented with mushroom cultivation in the deeper parts of the cave where no light reached at all, eventually growing enough shiitake and oyster mushrooms to begin trading them. The trading was how she met Thomas Wren. Thomas was 23, a quiet young man from over the mountain in Bell County who'd been driving a truck for a lumber company until the company went under. He'd heard about the woman selling winter mushrooms and fresh greens at the Crossroads Market and had driven 20 miles to see if it was true. He found Nettie behind a rough table with bundles of spinach, bags of dried mushrooms, and jars of pickled ramps arranged with a precision that spoke of pride in the product. "You grew all this?" he asked. "Every bit of it," she said. "Underground." He bought mushrooms. He came back the following week and bought greens. The third week he came back and asked if he could see how she did it. Nettie showed him the cave and the earth shelters she'd helped build on 3 neighboring properties, and the network of families who were now growing food through the winter for the first time in their lives. Thomas Wren fell in love with the operation first and the woman second, which was exactly the right order for someone like Nettie. They married in the fall of 1939 in a small ceremony outside the cave that had become Nettie's home and headquarters. Hazel Combs attended, sitting in a chair Thomas carried up the hill for her. She was 76 by then, and she told anyone who would listen that she'd delivered the bride. The following year, 1940, 2 things happened that changed the scale of everything. First, Hazel Combs died in her sleep in February and left her cabin and 12 acres of land to Nettie. Second, a county agricultural extension agent named Robert Fairchild came to see Nettie's earth shelters as part of a government survey of innovative farming practices. Fairchild was stunned. He'd studied agriculture at the University of Kentucky and had never seen anything quite like what this young woman had built. She was using principles of thermal mass, passive solar gain, and protected cultivation that were known in academic circles, but had never been applied this way, in this terrain, with these materials. He wrote a report that found its way to the state agricultural office in Frankfurt, and within 6 months, Nettie received a visit from 2 professors and a request to participate in a formal study. The attention brought something else: contact with Sutter's Hollow. Word travels in mountain communities. It's slow, but it's relentless. And by 1941, the people of Sutter's Hollow had heard about Nettie Groves. Some of them remembered the girl Cora Sloan had turned out 7 years earlier. They remembered watching her walk down the road. And now, here she was, featured in a state agricultural report, teaching families across 2 counties how to grow food through the winter. Cora Sloan heard about it too. And in the winter of 1942, when the war had taken most of the young men and food was scarcer than ever, Cora's stubbornness finally cracked. She sent word through a cousin asking if Nettie would come and teach the people of Sutter's Hollow how to build earth shelters. Nettie could have refused. She had every right to. She had every reason to. The woman who had thrown her out into the cold, who had slapped her for telling the truth, who had chosen a man's comfort over a child's safety. That woman was now asking for help. Thomas, who knew the full story, told Nettie it was her decision, and he'd support whatever she chose. Hazel wasn't there to give advice anymore, but Nettie could almost hear the old woman's voice. Spite never grew a single thing worth eating. Nettie went to Sutter's Hollow. She arrived on a cold morning in January, and half the town turned out to meet her. Cora was not among them. She stayed in her house, unable or unwilling to face the girl she'd wronged. But Dale Sloan was gone, drafted and sent to North Africa, and the house was Cora's problem alone now, along with 2 children who were hungry. Nettie didn't make a speech. She didn't demand an apology. She walked the hillsides around Sutter's Hollow, identified 3 good sites for earth shelters, and started teaching. She stayed for 2 weeks, sleeping in Mrs. Eubanks's spare room, Mrs. Eubanks who had given her the tin of sardines years ago, and who now wept openly when she saw the woman Nettie had become. On the last day, as Nettie was loading tools into Thomas's truck, Cora Sloan walked down the road to where she stood. The older woman's face was drawn and tired. She looked like she'd aged 20 years and 7. "I was wrong," Cora said. It was barely above a whisper. "About everything. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about him, and I've been wrong about most things in my life." Nettie looked at her aunt for a long time. Then she reached into the truck bed and pulled out a bundle, a package of seeds wrapped in cloth, with planting instructions written in Nettie's careful hand. "Start with the lettuce," Nettie said. "It's the most forgiving." Over the decades that followed, Nettie and Thomas Wren expanded their operation far beyond what that lonely girl in a cave could have imagined. By the 1950s, they had built 23 earth shelters across their property and Hazel's former land, and they were producing fresh greens, mushrooms, and herbs 12 months a year. They supplied a growing number of families, schools, and eventually small markets across eastern Kentucky. The university partnership led to a formal research program, and Nettie became an unpaid but widely respected consultant on cold climate agriculture. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, all of whom grew up understanding soil and seasons the way other children understood arithmetic. The eldest daughter, Pearl, named for Nettie's mother, eventually earned a degree in agricultural science, and returned to the mountains to continue the work. Nettie Groves Wren died on a September morning in 1996 at the age of 78. She died in the cabin that had been Hazel Combs' cabin, which she and Thomas had expanded over the years into a warm and book-filled home. Thomas had passed 2 years earlier. Their children and 7 grandchildren were nearby. The earth shelters were still producing. At her funeral, attended by over 300 people, Bertie Shepherd's eldest grandson, now a man in his 60s, stood up and said that his family had not gone hungry a single winter since 1936, and that was because of Nettie Groves. The Nettie Wren Center for Sustainable Mountain Agriculture, established the year after her death, still operates on the family land today. It teaches the same principles Nettie figured out in a cave with a trowel and a stack of borrowed books, that the earth itself wants to help you grow things if you pay attention. That warmth exists beneath the surface, even in the coldest season. That what looks like a hole in the ground can become a garden. What would you have done, standing on that dirt road at 16 with $10 and a canvas bag? Most of us will never face that exact test, but all of us face some version of it, the moment when the world tells us we're not wanted, not valued, not enough, the moment when everything we thought was solid falls away and we're left with nothing but what we carry inside. Nettie Groves carried curiosity. She carried her mother's knowledge of soil and her father's love of books. She carried a stubborn refusal to believe that the world's opinion of her was the final word. And from those things that nobody could take away, because nobody thought they were worth taking, she built a life that fed hundreds of families and outlasted everyone who ever doubted her. If this story resonated with you, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Because sometimes the most remarkable lives start in the most unremarkable places. A dirt road, a canvas bag, a cave in the mountains, and the stubborn belief that something can grow even in the darkest season.